The High Commander's observation deck offered a view that had broken lesser species. From this vantage point, Sebastian could see all 12 rings of the merchant fleet's staging ground, each one glittering with the accumulated wealth of 300 years of profitable expansion. 200 vessels in total, representing 42 member houses of the Krelix Merchant League, each one a testament to the superiority of disciplined commerce over primitive sentiment. Sebastian's mandibles clicked in satisfaction as he reviewed the holographic display. The human colonies represented a particular kind of opportunity. Resource-rich worlds defended by a species too sentimental to properly exploit their own assets. Their ships were museum pieces. Their tactics lifted wholesale from pre-spaceflight wargames. Their entire civilization built on the laughable notion that all sapient species deserved equal consideration. The delegation is requesting permission to board, High Commander. The communications officer's voice held barely concealed amusement. They'd all seen the human vessels, converted cargo haulers with weapon systems older than some of Sebastian's junior officers. "Let them come," Sebastian said, his three-fingered hand waving dismissively. "It will be instructive for the merchant captains to witness proper negotiation. Record everything." The humans arrived in a shuttle that looked held together by optimism and prayer. Sebastian watched through the docking port's observation window as 5 figures emerged, their faces pale and soft, their bodies fragile-looking without proper exoskeletons. They moved with the awkward grace of species that had evolved in gentle gravity, their eyes scanning the Krelix guards with an expression that Sebastian had learned to recognize across 100 species. Fear masquerading as dignity. The lead human was a woman who introduced herself as Ambassador Morgan. Her hair was black-streaked with gray, her clothing formal but simple, no attempt to match the ornate armor that Sebastian and his merchant house representatives wore. She carried a data slate that probably contained whatever pitiful offer Earth's government thought might satisfy the League's demands. "High Commander Sebastian." Morgan's voice was steady. He'd give her that much. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting." Sebastian allowed his mandibles to spread in the Krelix expression of condescension. Around the observation deck, representatives from a dozen merchant houses watched with barely concealed anticipation. They'd seen this performance before. The desperate, inferior species, the inevitable surrender, the profitable extraction of resources that always followed. "Your gratitude is premature, Ambassador," Sebastian said, letting each word hang in the recycled air. "You are here because the Merchant League has concluded that human space represents unclaimed value. Your colonies occupy 17 systems that contain rare Earth deposits we require. Your resistance to our previous offers has been noted as economically irrational." Morgan's expression didn't change, but Sebastian caught the subtle tensing of muscles around her jaw. Good. She understood the reality of her position. "We've reviewed your terms," Morgan said carefully. 90-year contracts that would give the League exclusive mining rights in exchange for outdated defensive technology, and trade restrictions that would prevent us from developing independent markets. "High Commander, these terms amount to indentured servitude." The observation deck filled with clicking, Krelix laughter. Sebastian let it continue for several seconds before raising one hand for silence. "Indentured servitude," he repeated, as if tasting the words. "You have a gift for colorful language, Ambassador. I prefer to think of it as guided economic development. The League has brought 117 species into profitable partnerships using similar frameworks. Many of them were far more advanced than your people when we first encountered them." He moved closer, studying Morgan's face with the intensity of a merchant appraising potential merchandise. "Do you know what they all had in common, Ambassador? They recognized their position in the universal hierarchy. They understood that pride is expensive, and poverty more so. Morgan met his gaze without flinching, and Sebastian felt a flicker of something that might have been respect if he'd been inclined towards such inefficient emotions. There was one exception to leak protocol, Morgan said quietly. 203 years ago, Navigator Kellis of the merchant vessel. Prophet's Reach encountered a human colony ship approaching a star system. Our ships were primitive, barely capable of interstellar travel. We had no sensors sophisticated enough to detect the solar flare building in that system. By League regulations, Kellis should have let us proceed. Non-interference with uncontacted species, Section 47 of your merchant code. Sebastian's mandibles tightened. Every Krelix in the observation deck knew this story. Kellis the foolish, Kellis the stripped, the navigator who had thrown away rank and pension to warn a species that had nothing to offer in return. Navigator Kellis violated protocol, Sebastian said coldly. She was punished appropriately. The League cannot function if individual sentiment overrides profitable decision-making. She saved 3,000 human lives, Morgan continued, her voice taking on an edge that Sebastian recognized from his experience with dozens of species on the edge of submission, defiance born of desperation. Warned us of the flare, helped us plot a safe course, asked nothing in return. When we reached our destination and finally had something to offer, we sent trade ships looking for her. We learned she'd been stripped of rank, her assets liquidated to repay the League for time wasted. As was proper, Sebastian interrupted. The League's resources are not charity. Every action has a cost that must be recovered. Morgan nodded slowly as if she'd expected this response. We took a vote, High Commander. All 3,000 survivors and their descendants. We voted to name our colony Kellis Station. Every human child born there learns her name in their first year of school. We remember kindness, High Commander. We build monuments to it. Sebastian clicked his mandibles in genuine confusion. You commemorate economic irrationality? Perhaps this explains your species' persistent poverty. We also remember cruelty, Morgan said, and now her voice carried something that made Sebastian's sensory pits flare with sudden awareness. We study it, catalog it, learn from it. We've spent 2 centuries watching the League operate, High Commander. We know how you negotiate. We know how you enforce. We know exactly what happens to species that accept your terms. She activated her data slate, and holographic images filled the space between them. Star systems, trade routes, economic projections, all marked with human notation that Sebastian's translator struggled to parse in real time. These are coordinates of your fleet positions, Morgan said calmly. All 200 vessels currently staging for your demonstration of force. We know where they are, High Commander. We know their capabilities, their tactical doctrine, their supply lines. We're not bluffing. We're not desperate. We're giving you one chance to reconsider your approach to human space. The observation deck fell silent. Sebastian felt the weight of a dozen merchant house representatives watching him, calculating, measuring his response. To show uncertainty now would be to invite challenges to his authority. To show fear would be to suggest that humans, might actually pose a threat to Krelix interests. He let his mandibles spread in full contempt. You attempt to intimidate me with basic intelligence gathering? Every species thinks they understand our tactics until they face our fleet in open space. You want to know what I see, Ambassador Morgan? I see clever apes who stumbled into the stars and now think they understand how the galaxy truly functions. Sebastian gestured at the holographic display with one chitinous hand. Your ships are outdated. Your technology is derivative. Your entire civilization exists because the League has permitted it to exist. You speak of remembering cruelty as if you have any frame of reference for what real power looks like when properly applied. He moved to the observation window, where the merchant fleet glittered in the darkness like a promise of inevitable dominance. I've subjugated species who could manipulate gravity with thought. I've broken civilizations that had mastered quantum engineering before your ancestors learned to make fire. You want to threaten me? You want to make warnings? Let me tell you what's going to happen, Ambassador. Sebastian turned back to face Morgan, and now his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. In 48 hours, my fleet will arrive at Earth. You will be given one final opportunity to accept our terms, revised upward for the cost of this little demonstration of defiance. If you refuse, we will systematically dismantle your orbital infrastructure until your government remembers that pride is the most expensive commodity in the galaxy. Are we clear? Morgan's expression remained neutral, but Sebastian saw her knuckles whiten around the data slate. There it was, the moment of breaking, the recognition of powerlessness that he'd witnessed across 100 species. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. "We're clear, High Commander," she said finally. "Excellent. Then, this meeting is concluded." Sebastian waved toward the docking port. "Return to Earth, Ambassador. Tell your leaders to prepare for economic integration. Tell them that the League always collects what it's owed." As the human delegation filed back toward their pathetic shuttle, Sebastian heard one of the merchant house representatives click in amusement. "Did you see her face? I thought she might actually weep." "They always look like that at first," another responded. "Then comes acceptance. Then comes profit." Sebastian watched the human shuttle detach and begin its journey back toward Earth's distant gleam. "Broadcast the recording," he ordered. "I want every captain in the fleet to see this. Let them understand what they're about to inherit, a species so deluded they think surveillance and sentiment constitute leverage." The recording of Morgan's attempted warning spread through Krellick's military channels within the hour, accompanied by Sebastian's commentary about Primitive's attempt at poetry and desperate bluffing by a species that doesn't understand its place. Officers throughout the fleet watched and clicked their amusement, sharing the footage with junior staff as an example of how inferior species behaved when confronted with inevitable subjugation. Sebastian retired to his private quarters that evening with the satisfaction of a transaction completed successfully. Tomorrow he would finalize the fleet's deployment. In 48 hours, humanity would learn what 117 species before them had learned: that the Krellick's Merchant League always collected its debts, always enforced its contracts, and never, ever forgot an insult to its commercial interests. Only Navigator Kellys had been foolish enough to place sentiment above profit. Sebastian had no intention of repeating her mistake. The 48 hours passed with the mechanical precision that had made the Krellick's Merchant League the dominant force in this sector of the galaxy. Sebastian stood on the command deck of his flagship, the Prophet's Crown, watching his tactical display populate with green markers representing 200 warships. Each vessel had been carefully positioned according to merchant house hierarchy, the most profitable houses claiming the forward positions where glory and salvage rights would be greatest, lesser houses forming support layers in perfect commercial order. "All vessels report ready status, High Commander," his tactical officer announced, mandibles clicking with barely restrained excitement. The young officer had never participated in a full fleet action before. Most Krellick's officers hadn't. Few species were foolish enough to require such demonstrations once they understood the League's reach. Sebastian activated the fleet-wide communication channel, his voice carrying to every bridge, every crew station, every merchant captain who had invested in this venture. "Captains of the Merchant League, we stand at the threshold of profitable expansion. The human species has demonstrated economic irrationality that threatens the stability of our commercial interests. They have rejected fair terms. They have attempted to threaten League operations. They have forgotten that sentiment is a luxury afforded only to those who can survive without it. He paused, letting his words register across 200 ships and over 50,000 crew members. Through the observation ports, Earth hung like a blue marble, its orbital infrastructure glittering in the sunlight. Refineries, habitation rings, defense platforms that looked formidable to primitive eyes, but which League intelligence had already categorized as obsolete technology. Our objective is simple, Sebastian continued. We will demonstrate the cost of defiance. We will dismantle their capacity for resistance. And we will show them that the galaxy operates on principles of profit and power, not poetry and sentiment. By this time tomorrow, humanity will beg to accept our revised terms, and the League will profit from their mistake for generations to come. The tactical display showed the fleet beginning its advance in perfect formation. 3 waves of capital ships surrounded by screens of lighter vessels, the entire armada moving with the synchronized precision that only rigorous merchant discipline could produce. Sebastian had run this scenario through tactical simulations 17 times. The longest engagement had lasted 6 hours. The shortest, 90 minutes. Against a species with humanity's technological limitations, he expected something closer to the latter. High Commander, we're detecting active scanning from multiple human positions, the sensor officer reported. 32 distinct signatures, all matching known human vessel configurations. They're not attempting to hide. Sebastian's mandibles spread in satisfaction. Of course they're not. They want us to see them. Want us to believe that transparency equals readiness. Show me their disposition. The holographic display shifted to show human ship positions scattered throughout Earth's orbital space like seeds thrown by a careless farmer. No formation, no obvious tactical arrangement, just isolated vessels that looked more like they were preparing to flee than fight. This is insulting, muttered Captain Varix of the merchant house Goldclaw, his voice carrying across the command channel. They're not even trying to mount a defense. Where's their battle line? Where's their command structure? Probably waiting to surrender until we're close enough to make it dramatic, another captain responded, accompanied by clicking laughter from multiple bridges. Sebastian studied the display with the analytical intensity that had made him High Commander. Something felt wrong. Morgan hadn't struck him as the type to collapse this quickly. The human ambassador had seemed almost calm during their confrontation, as if she'd expected his response. As if she'd been following a script that Sebastian couldn't quite read. Advance as planned, Sebastian ordered, pushing aside the momentary uncertainty. He'd conquered species far more dangerous than humans. He'd broken civilizations that made humanity look like children playing at space travel. Whatever plan the humans thought they had, it would crumble under the weight of proper military force applied with merchant efficiency. The fleet pressed forward, maintaining perfect formation. Sebastian's tactical display showed estimated combat ranges shrinking. 2 light seconds, 1 light second, optimal firing distance in 300 seconds. The human vessels remained stationary, making no attempt to maneuver or coordinate. It was exactly what every simulation had predicted. High Commander, we're receiving a transmission from the human flagship, the communications officer announced. Audio only, no encryption. They're broadcasting on open channels. Let them speak, Sebastian said. Record it. I want documentation of their surrender for the League archives. Ambassador Morgan's voice filled the command deck, and Sebastian noted with surprise that she sounded even calmer than she had during their face-to-face confrontation. No tremor of fear, no desperation, just measured, almost conversational tone. High Commander Sebastian, I told you we remembered kindness. I told you we remembered cruelty. You chose to interpret that as weakness. That was your first mistake. Sebastian's sensory pits flared with sudden alertness. Around the command deck, his officers exchanged glances of uncertainty. This wasn't how defeated species spoke in their final moments before subjugation. Your second mistake, Morgan continued, was assuming that because we valued mercy, we weren't capable of matching force with force. Navigator Kellis taught us something 2 centuries ago, High Commander. She taught us that the galaxy contains species capable of choosing compassion over profit. We built our civilization on that lesson. We prepared for 2 centuries based on that principle, and we swore that if the galaxy ever forced us to choose between submission and survival, we would show the same courage Kelly showed when she chose to save strangers at personal cost. On the tactical display, Sebastian saw something that made his mandibles lock in sudden tension. The human vessels were moving, not retreating but scattering in patterns that looked random, but which his tactical computer was already flagging as mathematically precise. Each ship was accelerating toward coordinates that shouldn't have any tactical significance. Your third mistake, Morgan said, and now her voice carried something that Sebastian recognized from his experience subjugating 100 species. Not fear, not desperation, certainty. Was assuming we spent 2 centuries studying your tactics so we could surrender more efficiently. We studied them so we would know exactly how to beat you. The lunar surface erupted. For a fraction of a second, Sebastian's mind tried to process what his sensors were showing as some kind of solar event, some unexpected stellar phenomenon that had nothing to do with human capability. Then, his tactical computer finished analyzing the energy signatures, and Sebastian understood with devastating clarity that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The moon base that League intelligence had categorized as a mining outpost and habitation facility was detonating in a controlled sequence that sent fragments, not random debris, but precisely calculated projectiles, directly into the forward line of his merchant fleet. Each fragment had been accelerated by underground explosives to velocities that turned moon rock into relativistic weapons. Captain Varix's flagship, the Golden Harvest, took a direct hit from a chunk of lunar surface the size of a cargo container. The impact overwhelmed shields that were designed to deflect energy weapons, not kinetic projectiles moving at a significant fraction of light speed. The Golden Harvest broke apart like ceramic struck by a hammer, atmosphere venting in glittering clouds, crew members tumbling into vacuum as their command deck shattered. "Evasive maneuvers," Sebastian shouted, but 200 ships couldn't react with perfect coordination, not when they'd been advancing in merchant house formation that prioritized prestige over tactical flexibility. The second wave of lunar fragments, smaller, faster, more numerous, tore through the fleet like stones through silk. The merchant's pride lost its entire port side. The profitable venture took a hit that sheared off its bridge tower, killing everyone in command and leaving the vessel tumbling with drives still firing. The economic necessity tried to turn, its captain recognizing the trap too late, and caught 3 fragments in rapid succession that turned the ship into an expanding cloud of superheated metal. Sebastian's tactical display lit up with damage reports and casualty figures that climbed with sickening speed. 17 ships destroyed in the first 45 seconds. 13 more crippled beyond immediate combat capability. And the human vessels, those scattered, seemingly panicked human ships, were now converging on precise intercept coordinates. "They drew us in," Captain Varix's second-in-command transmitted from the Golden Harvest's emergency bridge, his voice cracking with disbelief. "They destroyed their own moon base to—" The transmission cut off as another kinetic projectile found its mark. Sebastian's mandibles clicked in frantic calculation. The fleet was in disarray, but it was still a fleet. 200 ships, even minus the 17 destroyed, represented overwhelming force against 30 human vessels. They could recover. They could adapt. The fleeing human ships activated their weapon systems, and Sebastian realized with dawning horror that they hadn't been fleeing at all. They'd been positioning, drawing the Krelix fleet into a carefully calculated kill zone where every human vessel had optimal firing solutions against multiple targets. But they weren't firing conventional weapons. The lead human ship, a converted colony vessel that Sebastian's intelligence had dismissed as barely combat capable, activated drives that pushed it to acceleration levels that should have turned its crew into paste against their bulkheads. It wasn't maneuvering for a firing solution. It was accelerating directly toward the profitable future, one of the League's heavy cruisers. "That ship is going to ram," Sebastian's tactical officer shouted. "They're going to—" The impact happened at relativistic velocities. The human ship, its entire mass converted into kinetic energy, struck the profitable future amidships, and both vessels ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The explosion was bright enough to trigger automatic dimming on every viewport in the Krelix fleet. "They sacrificed an entire ship," whispered someone on the command deck, their voice carrying the kind of stunned disbelief that came from witnessing something that violated every principle of rational warfare. They just threw away a capital vessel and everyone aboard it." Sebastian's mind raced through tactical calculations, through economic analyses, through every framework the League used to evaluate conflict. You didn't sacrifice capital ships. You couldn't. The cost was astronomical. The return on investment was negative. It was economically insane and militarily irrational, and 2 more human ships accelerated toward Krelix vessels, their drives burning at intensities that suggested their crews had disabled every safety protocol. They were kinetic missiles piloted by people who had accepted death as the price of removing League ships from the battlefield. No merchant would do this. Captain Varix's replacement transmitted, his voice tight with something very close to fear. No rational species would accept these losses. "High Commander, they're not fighting to win territory or resources. They're fighting like they have nothing to lose," Sebastian finished quietly. But that wasn't quite right, and Sebastian knew it even as the words left his mandibles. The humans weren't fighting with the desperation of a species backed into a corner. They were fighting with the precision of a species that had planned this exact scenario down to the last detail. Every ship that sacrificed itself took out a target that had been selected for maximum tactical impact. Every detonation pattern suggested pre-positioned calculations that stretched back months or years. The humans hadn't been preparing to flee or surrender in these 48 hours. They'd been preparing for this exact engagement for decades, maybe centuries. "Hi, Commander. We're detecting additional energy signatures." The sensor officer's voice climbed toward panic. "Multiple sources throughout Earth's orbital space. They're activating." "Hi, Commander. Those aren't industrial platforms. They're—" The first railgun discharged from what League intelligence had confidently identified as a mineral processing facility. The projectile moved too fast for point defense systems designed to intercept missiles and energy weapons. It punched through the shields of the merchant's determination and out the other side, leaving a perfectly circular hole that vented the ship's atmosphere in a glittering spiral. Then the second platform fired, and the third, and the 17th. Sebastian's tactical display lit up with targeting solutions as his computer finally recognized the truth that Morgan had been trying to tell him during their meeting. Earth's orbital infrastructure wasn't industrial, it was military. Every platform, every facility, every structure that the League had cataloged as commercial development was actually a weapon system that had been waiting for this exact moment. "They've been building this for 2 centuries, Sebastian said aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "While we were watching them, while we were cataloging their technology as primitive, they were hollowing out asteroids and turning them into railgun platforms. They were studying our tactics and building weapons specifically designed to counter them. They were waiting." The railgun barrage was mathematically precise, not overwhelming firepower designed to saturate an area, but perfect targeting that exploited every gap in Krelix formations, every weakness in Merchant House tactical doctrine, every pattern that League fleets had used successfully against 100 species. The humans had studied those victories. They'd learned from them. They'd built an entire military strategy around the assumption that the Krelix would fight exactly as they always fought. And they were right. Sebastian watched his fleet, his carefully organized, perfectly coordinated merchant armada, dissolve into chaos as captains abandoned formation to save their own ships. Centuries of merchant individualism overrode military discipline. House rivalries that had been set aside for this venture reasserted themselves as captains calculated their personal losses versus collective victory. "All vessels maintain formation," Sebastian transmitted, but he could already see the response time lengthening as individual captains made individual decisions based on individual profit margins. The League's greatest strength, its rigid adherence to commercial principles, had become its fatal weakness when facing an enemy that didn't calculate warfare in terms of acceptable losses and return on investment. Another human ship accelerated to ramming velocity, this time targeting a cluster of merchant vessels that had broken formation. The captain of the lead Krelix ship tried to evade, maneuvering directly into the firing solution of a railgun platform. Both ships died within seconds of each other, but the human ship had been piloted by AI, while the Krelix vessel had carried 300 crew members representing dozens of merchant houses. Sebastian's sensory pits registered the bitter truth. The humans were trading expendable resources for irreplaceable personnel. They were fighting a war of attrition where every exchange favored them because they designed their forces specifically for this kind of conflict. Colony ships converted to kinetic missiles, AI pilots that didn't fear death, weapons platforms built from asteroids that cost nothing but time to construct. The Krelix had built their fleet on the principle that warfare was an extension of economics, that you won by applying superior resources with maximum efficiency. The humans had built theirs on the principle that warfare was about breaking the enemy's will to fight, regardless of cost. "Hi, Commander. We're receiving casualty reports from..." The communications officer's voice cut off as the Prophet's crown shuddered under a glancing hit from a railgun projectile. Sebastian gripped his command console as damage reports flooded in. Hull breach on Deck 7. Shield generators overloading. Portside weapons array offline. Around him, his command staff worked with desperate efficiency to keep the flagship operational, but Sebastian could see the larger tactical picture deteriorating with every passing second. 43 ships destroyed. 61 damaged beyond combat effectiveness. 109 vessels still functional but scattered across Earth's orbital space like leaves in a storm. Each captain fighting their own battle. Merchant discipline utterly collapsed. And the humans, those 30 obsolete vessels, were systematically working through the Krelix fleet with the precision of accountants balancing books. They knew exactly where every League ship was. They'd known before the battle started. Those coordinates Morgan had shown him weren't bluffing. They were targeting data. Fall back, Sebastian ordered, the words tasting like poison on his mandibles. All vessels retreat to Rally Point Gamma. We need to... The tactical display lit up with new contacts. Human ships were moving to block the exit vectors. Not all of them. The human fleet wasn't large enough to create a complete blockade, but they positioned themselves at the optimal retreat routes, the obvious escape trajectories that League tactical doctrine prescribed, because they'd studied that doctrine, published it in their military academies, Morgan had said. The humans knew how the Krelliks would retreat, because they'd spent 2 centuries learning every pattern, every standard response, every predictable reaction that made the Merchant League so efficient at subjugating inferior species. Sebastian felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 decades of commanding League forces. Not just tactical uncertainty, not just the recognition that a battle plan had failed, but the fundamental understanding that he had led 200 ships and over 60,000 personnel into a trap designed specifically for the Krelliks, baited with their own arrogance, sprung with the patience of a species that had learned to plan across centuries instead of quarterly profit statements. "Hi, Commander. What are your orders?" his tactical officer asked, mandibles trembling with barely controlled panic. Sebastian stared at the tactical display, watching green markers wink out one by one as human weapons found their targets, as merchant captains made desperate individual decisions that only furthered the chaos, as the most powerful commercial military force in this sector of the galaxy discovered what it felt like to be prey instead of predator. "Send to all vessels," he said slowly. "Scatter formation. Every captain for their own house. Break through the blockade by any means necessary." It was an admission of complete tactical defeat, abandoning any pretense of coordinated fleet action, reducing 200 warships to individual survivors trying to escape a carefully orchestrated massacre. But it was also the only order that acknowledged reality. The Krelliks Merchant League had gone to war against a species that remembered kindness and cruelty both, and had learned to repay each in equal measure. The humans had remembered. And now the Krelliks would too. The Prophet's crown lurched violently as another kinetic projectile tore through the starboard hull, sending Sebastian sprawling against his command console. Emergency lights flickered across the bridge, casting everything in alternating crimson and shadow. Through the viewport, he watched a merchant house cruiser, the Revenue's pride belonging to House Malthor, tumble end over end, its drives blown out, atmosphere venting from a dozen puncture wounds. 3 human fighters pursued it like predators harrying wounded prey, their weapons calculated to disable rather than destroy, forcing the cruiser's captain to watch his ship die slowly. "Hi, Commander. We're receiving distress calls from 67 vessels," the communications officer reported, her voice cracking. "House Vex is requesting immediate support. House Thon has lost all command authority. The Golden Margin reports its captain dead and—" "Tell them to follow scatter protocol," Sebastian interrupted, pulling himself upright. His secondary arms gripped the console edge while his primary manipulators worked the tactical display. "Every house for itself. Break through wherever you can find weakness in the human lines." It was the admission every Krelliks officer dreaded. The moment when coordinated fleet action collapsed into individual survival. The Merchant League's strength had always been its ability to mass resources, to apply overwhelming economic and military pressure in perfect synchronization. Scatter formation was what primitives did when they panicked. It was what prey did when the predator had already won. But Sebastian was watching the tactical display, and he could see no alternative. The human blockade wasn't complete. They didn't have enough ships for that. But they'd positioned themselves with mathematical precision at every optimal exit vector. They knew which routes League doctrine prescribed for retreat. They'd studied the Krelliks for 2 centuries, learning every pattern, every standard response, every predictable tactical choice that efficient warfare required. The humans weren't fighting efficiently, they were fighting intelligently. Helm, calculate jump coordinates for the inner asteroid field, Sebastian ordered. Emergency translation. Don't wait for fleet synchronization. Hi, Commander, that's a hazard zone. Navigation protocols specifically prohibit— Do it! Sebastian's mandibles clacked with desperate authority. The humans expect us to follow protocols. They're counting on it. Every standard retreat vector is a kill zone. His helm officer's manipulators trembled as she input the coordinates. The asteroid field orbiting beyond Mars was too dense for safe navigation, full of debris that could tear through shield systems. League doctrine classified it as a no-transit zone, which meant the humans probably weren't covering it as heavily. It was the kind of irrational, dangerous choice that a proper Krellix commander would never make, which was exactly why it might work. The Prophet's crown shuddered as its jump drives began cycling up to translation threshold. Around them, other Krellix vessels were attempting their own desperate escapes, some toward the blockaded exit vectors, some toward the asteroid field, some accelerating for deep space on conventional drives, hoping to outrun human pursuit. The perfect formation that had arrived at Earth with such confidence had dissolved into chaos, each captain making individual calculations about survival versus profit versus honor. That was when Sebastian noticed the new tactical markers appearing on his display. Not the human ships they'd been tracking, not the decoy platforms or the converted colony vessels or the stealth craft. These were different, larger signatures moving with coordinated precision from behind Earth's moon. Capital ships, real warships, not converted civilian hulls. 6 of them, then 12, then 24, emerging from concealment with the patient timing of a hunter who'd waited for exactly the right moment to reveal their full strength. How many ships do they have? Sebastian whispered, his voice barely audible over the bridge alarms. How many ships do these primitives have? His tactical officer manipulated the display, aggregating all sensor data from across the scattered fleet. The numbers made no sense. 30 visible ships had attacked initially. Now they were tracking 68 distinct human vessels, and more contacts were appearing with each sensor sweep. The humans had been hiding their fleet strength, spacing ships in orbits that looked like industrial traffic, disguising military vessels as civilian infrastructure, spreading their forces across Earth's entire orbital sphere so that Krellix scouts had only seen fragments of their actual capability. And they'd been patient enough to let the Krellix fleet enter Earth's orbital space completely, patient enough to spring their trap only after Sebastian's forces were too deep to retreat easily, patient enough to spend 2 centuries preparing for this exact confrontation, while the Merchant League assumed the primitive species would eventually accept subjugation. Translation in 90 seconds, the helm officer reported. Sebastian watched one of the new capital ships, massive compared to the nimble fighters and converted colony vessels, angle toward a cluster of Krellix cruisers attempting to break through the blockade. Its weapons were different from the kinetic launchers and railguns the humans had deployed so far. Energy signatures were building along its hull, systems cycling up with the distinctive pattern of— The human capital ship fired, not projectiles, directed energy beams, coherent and devastating, that carved through Krellix shields like they weren't there. 3 merchant house cruisers died in the span of 10 heartbeats, their hulls superheating and detonating, their debris adding to the expanding cloud of wreckage that had been Sebastian's armada. They have energy weapons, Sebastian's tactical officer said, mandibles trembling. The intelligence reports said humans didn't have functional directed energy systems. Our shields are specifically calibrated to counter kinetic threats because humans supposedly couldn't. They lied, Sebastian interrupted, understanding flooding through him like ice water. Or they let us think we knew their capabilities. They showed us what we expected to see: obsolete ships, kinetic weapons, inferior technology. They let us believe we understood their limitations. Another human capital ship fired, its beams tracking Krellick's vessels with perfect accuracy. The League shields, designed to disperse kinetic impacts, offered almost no protection against the focused energy. Ships that had survived the initial kinetic barrage were dying now, their captains frantically trying to recalibrate defensive systems for a threat they hadn't anticipated. The humans had deliberately allowed the Krellicks to study their weapons technology, had sold them obsolete kinetic systems while keeping their energy weapons hidden, had let League intelligence compile reports about human military weakness that were completely, devastatingly wrong. Translation in 60 seconds, the helm officer announced. Sebastian's manipulators gripped his console hard enough that the metal creaked. Around him, the tactical display was a chaos of dying ships, desperate retreat attempts, and human forces systematically dismantling 2 centuries of Merchant League dominance in this sector. Not through overwhelming numbers, not through superior technology, though they clearly had been hiding their capabilities, but through patience, through planning, through the willingness to spend decades preparing for a confrontation while appearing weak and vulnerable. The humans had remembered Kellis, had remembered the one Krelliks who showed them kindness 200 years ago. And instead of becoming vengeful, instead of turning into the kind of species that would have justified League subjugation, they'd become something worse for the Krelliks' purposes. They'd become strategists, patient, disciplined strategists who planned across centuries and refused to forget either mercy or cruelty. "Hi, Commander. We're receiving a transmission," his communications officer reported. "Sources: it's Ambassador Morgan, sir, broadcasting on all Krellick's military frequencies." "Put it through," Sebastian ordered, though part of him didn't want to hear whatever the human diplomat had to say. Morgan's face appeared on the main viewer. The human ambassador looked tired, lines deep around her eyes, but there was no triumph in her expression, no joy in the destruction playing out across Earth's orbital space. He looked like someone performing a necessary but unpleasant task. "Hi, Commander Sebastian," Morgan said, her voice calm and measured. "Your fleet is defeated. You have approximately 90 vessels still capable of translation, scattered across a battle space where every optimal exit vector is covered by human forces. You can continue fighting, and we will continue destroying League ships. Or you can surrender, and your people will be treated according to the accords of civilized warfare." Sebastian felt his mandibles click in bitter amusement. Civilized warfare. As if the humans hadn't just butchered over 100 Krelliks ships with cold calculation, as if they hadn't spent 2 centuries preparing this trap while pretending to be victims. "And if I refuse?" Sebastian asked. "Then you'll die," Morgan replied simply. "Along with everyone under your command who doesn't escape. We won't pursue fleeing vessels beyond the orbital engagement zone. We won't hunt down survivors, but we will prevent any League ship from threatening Earth or our colonial territories." Morgan paused, and something shifted in his expression. "We learned from Navigator Kellis, High Commander. She showed us kindness when we were powerless. She proved that not every species in the galaxy views others as resources to exploit. We would prefer to honor her memory by showing mercy today, but we're fully prepared to demonstrate the alternative if necessary." Translation in 30 seconds, the helm officer reported quietly. Sebastian stared at the human ambassador's face on the display. Mercy. The humans were offering mercy, even while systematically dismantling the most powerful merchant fleet the League had assembled in a generation. Even while demonstrating capabilities that would force the Krelliks to completely reassess their understanding of human military strength. They were offering him a choice that Sebastian himself had never given to species the League had subjugated. All vessels, cease fire, Sebastian ordered, the words tasting like poison and ash. Stand down weapon systems, prepare to receive surrender terms. The bridge fell silent. His officers stared at him with mandibles hanging open in shock. A Krellik's high commander didn't surrender. The Merchant League didn't negotiate from weakness. You fought until victory or you fled to preserve assets for future profit. Surrender was for species that didn't understand commerce, that didn't grasp that every interaction was a transaction with winners and losers. But Sebastian was looking at the tactical display, at the scattered remains of his fleet, at the human capital ships moving into position to destroy any vessel that attempted escape. He was thinking about Navigator Kellis, who had violated League protocol to warn humans about a solar flare 2 centuries ago, who had been stripped of rank for showing mercy to primitives, who had apparently planted a seed that had grown into something the Merchant League couldn't counter with mere economic pressure and military superiority. Cancel translation, Sebastian added quietly. Helm. Reduce velocity to station keeping. Comms. Transmit our surrender to all human forces and all League vessels still in the engagement zone. High Commander, if we surrender, the Merchant Council will... His tactical officer began. The Merchant Council isn't here, Sebastian interrupted, his voice flat and dead. They're not watching their ships die. They're not seeing what these humans are capable of. And they're not going to face the consequences of arrogance that assumed inferior species would always remain inferior. On the main viewer, Ambassador Morgan nodded slowly. Your cooperation is noted, High Commander. Human recovery vessels are moving to your position. They'll escort the Prophet's Crown to a secure anchorage where we can discuss terms. Your crew will not be harmed. Wounded will receive medical attention. And I promise you, Commander, you'll be treated better than the League would have treated us if the battle had gone differently. The transmission ended. Sebastian stood on his damaged bridge, surrounded by officers who couldn't quite meet his gaze, and watched through the viewport as human vessels moved among the wreckage of his fleet. Not hunting survivors, not finishing off damaged ships, but actually beginning rescue operations, dispatching shuttles toward Krellik's vessels that were venting atmosphere, targeting ships where life support was failing. They were saving enemy crews, actively rescuing Krelliks who had come to subjugate them. They're insane, his tactical officer whispered, watching the same scene. This makes no economic sense. Enemies are liabilities or assets. You enslave them or eliminate them. You don't rescue them. Sebastian didn't respond. He was thinking about Navigator Kellis again, about the report he'd read decades ago about her court-martial. She'd argued that mercy was an investment in future relationships, that kindness could yield returns across generations. The Merchant Council had laughed at her testimony, had used it as evidence of her mental instability, her unfitness for command. Now, 2 centuries later, that investment was paying returns the Council had never imagined. The humans weren't showing mercy because they were weak. They were showing mercy because they'd learned it from Kellis and wanted the galaxy to see that wisdom and strength could coexist. A human shuttle approached the Prophet's Crown, transmitting docking clearance codes. Sebastian straightened his posture, arranged his ceremonial vestments, and prepared to become the first Krellix High Commander in League history to formally surrender to a species the Merchant Council had classified as primitive. The irony wasn't lost on him. Neither was the lesson. The Krellix Merchant League had spent centuries believing that power and profit were the only currencies that mattered in galactic relations. They'd built an empire on the principle that superior force and economic leverage could subjugate any inferior species. The humans had just demonstrated with devastating clarity that there was at least one currency the League had forgotten to calculate: memory, patience, and the willingness to become exactly as formidable as necessary to protect what you valued, while maintaining the principles that defined who you were. As Sebastian walked toward the airlock to meet his captors, he found himself wondering what the Merchant Council would do with this information. How they'd respond to the news that humanity had defeated a League fleet, not through luck or desperation, but through careful preparation and strategic patience. Whether they'd recognize that the galaxy's power dynamics had shifted in the span of a single battle. But mostly, he wondered if anyone on the council would understand what he'd finally grasped during the last moments of the battle. The lesson that Navigator Kellis had tried to teach 2 centuries ago, that the humans had learned and mastered, that the Merchant League had dismissed as sentiment and inefficiency. Kindness wasn't weakness, it was an investment. And the humans had just demonstrated a return on that investment that would reshape this entire sector of space. The airlock cycled open. Ambassador Morgan stood on the other side, flanked by human Marines in powered armor, their weapons lowered but ready. The ambassador extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting and agreement. "Hi, Commander Sebastian," Morgan said quietly. "Welcome aboard. Let's discuss how we prevent this from ever happening again." Sebastian looked at the extended hand for a long moment, then reached out with his primary manipulator and clasped it. The ambassador's grip was firm, his palm warm against Sebastian's chitinous digits. Behind them, through the airlock viewport, Earth hung in space like a blue jewel, scarred by 2 centuries of Krellix pressure, surrounded by the wreckage of a battle that had redefined the balance of power in this region. But still there, still whole, still defended by a species that had learned to combine mercy with strength in exactly the right proportions. The Krellix had taught humanity that the galaxy was a place where the strong exploited the weak. Navigator Kellis had taught them that it didn't have to be that way. And now humanity was teaching the Merchant League that there were consequences for forgetting the difference between power and wisdom. Sebastian had a feeling this lesson would be expensive. For the League, for the Council, for everyone who dismissed humanity as primitives, not worth the effort of understanding. The humans had remembered. And now, the entire galaxy would learn what that meant. The shuttle's interior was utilitarian, efficient in the way that human military design seemed to favor function over the ornamental displays the Krellix preferred. Sebastian settled into a seat designed for human proportions, his segmented body adjusting awkwardly to the contours, while Ambassador Morgan sat across from him, flanked by Marines whose armor bore scorch marks and impact dents from the recent battle. The evidence of combat clung to everything: the acrid smell of discharged weapons, the faint tremor in the shuttle's frame, the exhaustion etched into every human face. "Your people fought well," Sebastian said finally, breaking the silence as the shuttle detached from the Prophet's Crown and began its descent toward Earth's orbital command platform. "Better than our intelligence predicted. Better than any species we've encountered in 3 centuries of expansion." Morgan nodded slowly, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp, assessing. We had good teachers. The Merchant League taught us what happens to species who can't defend themselves. You taught us to prepare, to calculate, to never assume mercy from those who view strength as the only virtue worth respecting. Navigator Kellis, Sebastian began, taught us something different, Morgan finished. She taught us that mercy isn't weakness when it's backed by the capability to destroy. That kindness is most valuable when extended from a position of strength. We've had 2 centuries to understand that lesson, High Commander, to build our capabilities while remembering her example. The shuttle's viewport revealed the scope of what humanity had built. Sebastian had reviewed the tactical data before the battle: orbital platforms, defensive arrays, industrial infrastructure. He'd dismissed it as adequate for a developing species, impressive for primitives, but manageable for League forces. Now, seeing those same installations from inside the human defensive perimeter, understanding what they'd actually concealed, he recognized his fundamental error. Every platform had been designed not just for its stated commercial or industrial purpose, but as a weapon system. The mining facilities that processed asteroid ore could redirect their extraction lasers with devastating effect. The manufacturing stations that produced civilian goods housed fabrication systems that could switch to military production within hours. The habitat modules that supported human populations were hardened against assault, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, connected by transportation networks that doubled as rapid military deployment corridors. The humans hadn't built a defensive network around Earth. They'd turned the entire orbital space into a weapon, every component serving dual purpose, every system designed to look innocuous while concealing lethal capability. It was brilliant. It was patient. It was exactly the kind of long-term strategic thinking the Merchant Council insisted primitives couldn't master. How long? Sebastian asked. How long have you been preparing for this? Morgan glanced at one of the Marines, a woman whose armor nameplate read Kowalski, and whose expression suggested she'd heard too much combat chatter and seen too many shipmates die to have patience for defeated enemies seeking comfortable answers. But she remained silent, professional, while Morgan considered her response. Since the day Navigator Kelly sacrificed her career to save our colony ship, Morgan said finally. We understood immediately what her actions meant. That the League would never forgive her kindness. That her people would punish her for choosing morality over profit. We knew then that we'd eventually face a choice: accept subjugation or build the strength to defend ourselves while maintaining the principles she demonstrated. The shuttle docked with a station 3 times the size of the Prophet's crown, its corridors bustling with human personnel coordinating rescue operations, processing surrendered Krellick's crew, managing the aftermath of a battle that had redefined the balance of power in this sector. Sebastian walked through those corridors flanked by Marines, watching humans work with efficient determination, their faces showing exhaustion and grief, but also satisfaction. The knowledge that they'd defended their home successfully. They passed a medical bay where human doctors treated Krellick's wounded, their techniques adapted for alien physiology, their demeanor professional despite treating enemies who'd come to subjugate them. Sebastian saw a young human surgeon carefully repairing a Krellick's warrior's damaged breathing apparatus, her hands steady, her focus absolute. The warrior's secondary eyes tracked Sebastian as he passed, recognition and shame mingling in that gaze. We didn't expect mercy, the warrior rasped through his damaged translator. The council said humans were primitive, that they'd execute prisoners or sell them to labor markets. That's what we would have done. The surgeon didn't pause in her work. That's the difference between us and you, she said quietly. We remember kindness. We learned it matters more than cruelty, even when cruelty would be easier. Morgan led Sebastian to a conference room overlooking Earth, its blue surface marred by the scars of 2 centuries of Krellix pressure, but still beautiful, still vibrant with life and civilization. The room filled quickly. Human military officers, diplomatic staff, representatives from Earth's various national governments and colonial administrations. Sebastian found himself the focus of dozens of human gazes, each one carrying weight, history, the accumulated resentment of generations forced to accept predatory contracts and unfair trade terms. Admiral Torres entered last, her uniform crisp despite the battle she'd commanded, her posture erect, her expression carefully controlled. Sebastian had studied her file before the engagement. She'd lost family to a Krellix mining accident 3 decades ago, an incident the League had classified as acceptable operational losses and refused to compensate. She had every reason to hate him personally, to make his captivity uncomfortable, to repay cruelty with cruelty. Instead, she simply gestured for him to sit, then settled into her own chair with the careful movements of someone managing pain from recent injuries. High Commander Sebastian, Torres began, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who just won an impossible victory and knew it. You came to our system with 200 warships intending to force our subjugation through overwhelming force. You brought enough firepower to glass every city on Earth, to destroy our orbital infrastructure, to reduce humanity to a servile species dependent on League generosity for survival. Your intentions were clear, your objectives explicit, your expectations absolute. Sebastian remained silent, recognizing this wasn't a question, but an accounting, a formal statement of facts that would be transmitted throughout human space and beyond. We defeated your fleet using capabilities you dismissed as impossible for primitives, Torres continued. We destroyed 177 League warships and captured or disabled the remaining 23. We killed approximately 43,000 Krellix warriors and support personnel. We demonstrated tactical and strategic capabilities that invalidate every assumption the Merchant Council made about human military potential. The Admiral paused, letting those facts settle like stones dropped into still water, each one creating ripples that would spread outward indefinitely. By the standards the Merchant League has established through centuries of conquest, Torres said quietly, we would be justified in enslaving your survivors, selling them to labor markets, stripping your vessels for salvageable components, and broadcasting your defeat as entertainment for those species you've subjugated. That's what the League would do. That's what your own tactical doctrine recommends. Liquidate enemy assets for maximum return on investment. Sebastian felt his breathing apparatus constrict, anticipating what would come next. This was the moment when victors claimed their spoils, when mercy ended and calculations of profit began. He'd participated in a dozen such meetings, watched defeated species realize their captivity would be permanent, their people reduced to resources to be exploited. He'd considered it efficient, even necessary. The natural order of galactic politics where strength determined every relationship's terms, but Admiral Torres surprised him. We're not going to do that, she said simply. Navigator Kellis taught us something your Merchant Council has forgotten, that mercy creates alliances more durable than subjugation, that kindness generates returns across generations, that treating defeated enemies with dignity costs less than eternal occupation. We're going to demonstrate what your people could become if they chose cooperation over exploitation. The Admiral activated a holographic display showing the current status of the Krellix survivors. Medical care being provided, temporary quarters assigned, communication systems being restored so prisoners could contact their families, wounded being stabilized, bodies being prepared for return to their homeworlds with full ceremonial honors. The humans were treating enemy dead with more respect than the League typically afforded its own lower caste workers. Your crew will be detained until we negotiate terms, Torres explained. But they'll be treated according to human military protocol regarding prisoners of war: adequate food, medical care, recreation, communication privileges. They'll be safe, comfortable, and they'll go home when this is resolved. Not as slaves or damaged goods, but as warriors who fought bravely for their government and were defeated by a superior force. Sebastian stared at the display, his mind struggling to process this strategic insanity. The Merchant Council would never understand this. They'd analyze the human decision as weakness, evidence of insufficient resolve, proof that primitives couldn't maintain dominance even after achieving victory. They'd probably launch another fleet within months, assuming they could exploit this human sentimentality. But then he remembered the battle. He remembered the patient planning, the perfect execution, the devastating capabilities humanity had concealed until the moment they were needed. And he understood that the humans had calculated this precisely. They knew the Council would view mercy as weakness, and they were prepared to teach that lesson again if necessary. There will be consequences, Sebastian said carefully. The Merchant Council won't accept this defeat passively. They'll view your mercy as proof that humans lack the resolve to enforce their victory. They'll authorize further military action, possibly alliance with other expansionist powers. You've won this battle, but the war has just begun. Morgan leaned forward, her expression patient, almost sympathetic. High Commander, we've been at war with the Merchant League since the day you classified us as primitives worth exploiting. The only difference now is that you know it. You understand what we're capable of, and you're going to carry that knowledge back to your council, along with a message they need to hear. The ambassador produced a data crystal, placing it carefully on the conference table between them. Sebastian recognized Krellick's military encryption patterns on its surface, indicating it contained information formatted for League command systems. This contains complete tactical data from the battle, Morgan explained. Sensor logs, engagement analyses, casualty reports, everything your council needs to understand exactly how thoroughly you were defeated. It also contains proposals for a new relationship between humanity and the Merchant League. Trade terms based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation, defense agreements that acknowledge our respective capabilities, diplomatic protocols that treat both species as equals rather than superior and inferior. The Council will never accept, Sebastian began. The Council will accept whatever terms preserve their power and profits, Admiral Torres interrupted, her voice hard now, stripped of diplomatic courtesy. We're offering them the opportunity to transition from predatory merchants to legitimate partners. But if they refuse, if they choose to continue viewing humanity as primitives worth subjugating, then we'll demonstrate again why that's a fatal miscalculation. Except next time, our fleet will be arriving at Krellick's Prime instead of defending Earth. The threat hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Sebastian knew Torres meant it absolutely. The humans had proven they could defeat League forces on defense. Given time to build, to prepare, to deploy their patient strategic planning toward offensive operations, they could devastate Krellick's infrastructure with the same methodical efficiency they demonstrated today. You're offering peace, Sebastian said slowly, understanding crystallizing. But from a position of absolute strength. You're giving us the choice, cooperation or destruction, while demonstrating you have both the capability and willingness to follow through on either option. Navigator Kellis gave us peace when we were weak, Morgan replied. She showed mercy when her own government demanded she prioritize profit over morality. We learned from that example. Now we're offering the Merchant League the same choice she made. You can be the species that recognizes humanity's value, and builds a partnership. Or you can be the species that forced us to demonstrate our strength repeatedly until you acknowledge reality. Sebastian picked up the data crystal, his manipulators steady despite the weight of what this conversation meant. He was being sent home not as a defeated commander to be court-martialed and discarded, but as a messenger, carrying terms that would reshape the League's entire strategic calculus. The Council would want to kill him for this defeat, but they'd need him alive to explain exactly how humans had achieved victory, what capabilities they'd demonstrated, what preparations they'd require to avoid this outcome repeating. "I'll deliver your message," he said formally. "I'll provide complete testimony about human capabilities, tactical doctrine, strategic patience. I'll recommend the Council accept your terms and acknowledge humanity's status as an equal power rather than subjugatable primitives." "And if they don't listen?" Morgan asked quietly. Sebastian met the ambassador's gaze directly, recognizing in those human eyes the same calculation he'd seen in Navigator Kellis's expression 2 centuries ago when she defied League orders to save human lives. That same willingness to do what was right regardless of immediate consequences. That same understanding that some principles mattered more than profit or power. "Then I'll request asylum," Sebastian said, the words feeling strange in his translator but absolutely sincere. Because if the Merchant Council can't learn from this defeat, if they insist on repeating the same mistakes that brought us here, then they deserve whatever consequences humanity delivers. And I'd rather be remembered as the commander who recognized humanity's potential than the one who led the League into extinction through stubborn pride. Torres actually smiled at that, a fierce expression that conveyed respect for an enemy who'd learned his lesson thoroughly. "That's the first genuinely intelligent thing you've said since we pulled you off your flagship, Commander. Maybe there's hope for your species after all." The meeting concluded with formalities. Documentation signed, transfer protocols established, schedules set for Sebastian's return to League space aboard a human courier vessel. The humans were even providing him with a small honor guard, not as jailers but as escorts ensuring his safe passage, demonstrating to any League forces they encountered that the High Commander was under human protection and any attack would be considered an act of war. Morgan walked Sebastian to the shuttle bay personally, their conversation shifting from military matters to personal ones, the ambassador sharing stories about Navigator Kellis that had become part of human cultural mythology over the past 2 centuries. How children learned her name in schools as an example of courage and moral clarity. How her warning had saved not just the 3,000 people aboard that colony ship, but their descendants, now numbering hundreds of thousands, who'd built successful settlements and contributed to human civilization across multiple worlds. "She changed our entire trajectory," Morgan explained as they walked. "Before Kellis, we assumed the galaxy was uniformly hostile, that every alien species would view us as threats or resources to be exploited. She taught us that individuals could transcend their culture's limitations, that kindness could exist even within systems designed around cruelty. That lesson shaped every decision we made afterward, including how we prepared for this confrontation with your fleet." "You could have destroyed us completely," Sebastian observed. "Your capabilities far exceeded what you deployed. I've reviewed the tactical data. You held back, used only enough force to achieve victory without maximizing Krellick's casualties." "Why?" Morgan stopped at the shuttle bay entrance, turning to face Sebastian fully. "Because Navigator Kellis taught us that the goal isn't to destroy your enemies completely, but to transform them into something better. She could have let our colony ship burn when that solar flare hit. Would have been safer for her career, more profitable for the League. Instead, she chose to save us, accepting personal consequences to do what was right. We learned from that. Now we're teaching the Merchant League the same lesson. You can choose to become partners instead of predators, and we'll help you make that transition. But if you choose to remain predators, we'll defend ourselves and others with whatever force necessary. The shuttle waited, its engines humming, ready for departure. Sebastian boarded slowly, his body aching from injuries sustained during the battle, his mind overwhelmed by the past 12 hours. Everything he'd believed about galactic power dynamics had been inverted. Every assumption the Merchant Council made about primitive species had been proven catastrophically wrong. Every strategy the League relied upon had been countered with patient planning and devastating execution. As the shuttle lifted from the bay, Sebastian watched Earth recede through the viewport, that blue jewel hanging in space, surrounded by the debris of his defeated fleet. Human vessels moved through the wreckage conducting rescue operations, saving Krellick's lives, recovering bodies, demonstrating mercy even after victory. It was insane. It was inefficient. It was going to reshape the entire galactic order because species watching these broadcasts would recognize what the humans understood, that mercy from strength was more powerful than cruelty from dominance. The journey back to Krellick's Prime would take 3 weeks at conventional speeds, giving Sebastian time to prepare his report, to organize the tactical data, to construct arguments that might convince the Merchant Council to abandon centuries of predatory expansion in favor of the partnership humanity offered. He doubted they'd listen. The Council had become wealthy and powerful through exploitation, had built an empire on the principle that superior force justified any action. They'd view human mercy as exploitable weakness rather than strategic wisdom. But maybe, if he presented the evidence carefully, if he emphasized the capabilities humanity had demonstrated alongside the restraint they'd shown, if he could make the Council understand that their choice was between cooperation and eventual annihilation, maybe they'd recognize reality before humanity was forced to deliver another lesson in consequences. And if they didn't listen, if they insisted on continuing their predatory practices and viewing humanity as prey worth hunting, then Sebastian would follow through on his promise. He'd request asylum with the species that had defeated him, would help humanity understand Krellick's vulnerabilities and strategic weaknesses, would assist in protecting other species from the League's exploitation. Because Navigator Kellis had been right 2 centuries ago, and the humans had proven her wisdom today, mercy mattered more than profit. Principles mattered more than power. And the species that understood those truths would ultimately inherit the galaxy. 3 weeks later, Sebastian stood before the Merchant Council's full assembly. His report delivered, the tactical data reviewed, the scope of their defeat made absolutely clear through documentation and testimony. The council members sat in their traditional circular arrangement, their expressions ranging from disbelief to fury, to calculating assessment of what this meant for League interests. "You're recommending we accept subjugation to primitives?" Council Director Velis demanded, his translator crackling with indignation. "You lost a single battle and now you counsel surrender to species we've exploited successfully for centuries?" "I counsel recognition of reality," Sebastian replied, his voice steady despite knowing this testimony might end his career or his life. Humanity isn't primitive. They concealed capabilities that exceed our own in multiple domains: stealth technology, kinetic weapons, tactical coordination, strategic patience. They defeated us using our own documented doctrine against us, proving they've studied League operations for generations and prepared specifically to counter our advantages. "Then we build a larger fleet," another council member suggested. "We allocate resources for overwhelming force, enough ships that human tricks become irrelevant." Sebastian activated the holographic display, showing human defensive capabilities in detail, explaining how their entire orbital infrastructure served dual military and civilian purposes, how their decentralized command structure made them resilient against disruption, how their willingness to accept casualties made traditional attrition warfare ineffective. They're offering peace, he concluded. Partnership on equal terms, trade agreements that benefit both species, mutual defense against external threats. They're giving us the opportunity Navigator Kellis gave them 2 centuries ago, the chance to choose cooperation over conflict, to recognize that mercy from strength creates better outcomes than cruelty from dominance. The council chamber fell silent. Sebastian could see calculations happening behind alien eyes, assessments of profit and risk, considerations of how this defeat would affect League standing among other species. The Merchant Council had built its empire on reputation. The belief that Krellick's forces were invincible, that League contracts were inescapable, that subjugated species stayed subjugated. Humanity had shattered that reputation in a single engagement. "We'll consider your recommendations," Director Velis said finally, his tone suggesting the deliberations would be complex and prolonged. "You're confined to quarters pending further investigation of your conduct during the battle. Dismissed." Sebastian left the council chamber knowing his fate remained uncertain, but he delivered humanity's message. He'd explained their capabilities and their restraint, their strength and their principles, their willingness to offer partnership or deliver consequences as circumstances required. The council would debate, would calculate, would eventually recognize that accepting human terms was more profitable than courting extinction through stubborn pride. And if they didn't, if they chose to view mercy as weakness worth exploiting, then humanity would demonstrate again why that was a fatal miscalculation. Except next time, the battle would be fought over Krellick's prime instead of Earth. And next time, the humans might not show the same restraint they demonstrated when defending their home. 2 centuries ago, Navigator Kellis had warned a human colony ship about an impending solar flare, sacrificing her career to save lives her government considered insignificant. The humans had remembered that kindness, had built their entire strategic preparation around honoring her example while recognizing the cruelty her people represented. Now the galaxy would learn what that combination meant. Humanity would defend themselves with devastating efficiency, would show mercy from positions of absolute strength, would offer partnership to former enemies while remaining prepared to destroy those who rejected cooperation. The Merchant League could choose which version of humanity they faced going forward. Sebastian had delivered that choice along with the evidence of what each option entailed. Now, the Council would decide whether the League evolved or perished, whether they learned from defeat or repeated their mistakes until humanity was forced to teach harder lessons. In his quarters that night, Sebastian composed a message to Navigator Kellis, who'd lived in exile for 2 centuries after defying League orders to save human lives. He explained what had happened, how her kindness had reshaped human civilization, how they'd honored her example while defending themselves against her people, how her choice had ultimately led to this moment when the Merchant League faced transformation or extinction. He ended the message with a question. Did you know 2 centuries ago when you warned that colony ship that you were changing the galaxy's trajectory? That your mercy would eventually force the League to recognize that strength without wisdom leads only to destruction? He sent the message, uncertain whether she'd respond or even receive it. But he needed her to know that her sacrifice had mattered, that the humans had learned her lesson and taught it forward, that the galaxy was different now because she'd chosen kindness over profit when it mattered most. 3 days later, her response arrived, brief and profound. I knew the humans would remember. I hoped they'd teach us to be better. Thank you for helping them do that, Commander. The galaxy needs that lesson now, more than ever. Sebastian read those words repeatedly, understanding finally what Navigator Kellis had recognized 2 centuries ago and what humanity had proven through their victory and subsequent mercy. The galaxy didn't need more predators, more species competing to dominate and exploit. It needed examples of species that combined strength with wisdom, capability with restraint, victory with mercy. Humanity had become that example. And now every species watching these events would learn what the Krelliks had learned. That kindness, remembered across generations, was more powerful than cruelty, enforced through dominance. That mercy from strength transformed galaxies, while exploitation only perpetuated cycles of violence and resistance. The humans had remembered, and their memory had changed everything.